So let's get literal here. Let's just keep. I'm gonna keep this brief. You know, when I was in college, I met this guy. One of the first things I did is I met this guy. It was completely different from me. He was like 100% the opposite of who I was, and he antagonized me, and I antagonized him. At some point, I ended up appreciating him. Let's put it that way. He told me at some point that among other things he had going on in his family, that his parents worked at a university that just so happened to factor very prominently into my high school. That I did something during high school that referenced that college. It was actually a college very directly. And it was a very small, obscure college. So it was like this strange coincidence. But then he told me his grandfather was a lawyer. And not just a lawyer, but like a badass lawyer. And that he had actually founded was one of the founders of an organization of lawyers that was a very provocative organization of lawyers. Now he and I knew each other for some time. You know, ended up having different lives. Let's put it that way. I will say that getting to know him was one of the best things that ever happened to me because it challenged pretty much everything I believed in. But I am not at all in any way, shape, or form upset about that. I'm actually grateful. However, we chose very different life courses. And he did things that I would have, probably called him a sellout fascist for. And I did things that I'm sure he would have called me, I don't know, some sort of left deviationist for. I don't know. But at the point in time, there was something going on. And he made some political decisions that I was on the other side of. Didn't get to actually speak with him for a while. I bring this up because years later, I had come back from traveling outside of the country where I was a teacher at a school. And while I was a teacher at a school, I remembered that and knew that I had been connected to communities in Honduras from when I'd gone there in 2002 that had a specific kind of political experience and organizing and background that was different than the community I was in at the time. And it was almost as if it was this complementarity and yet this sort of obscurated understanding that when the understanding of the conceptualization of the struggles of the people that I'd met before, at least as they got reflected in the United States later and over time, got presented about what they were dealing with in Honduras. The perspective I was in and among at that time was never presented in any way, shape, or form. And it's because it just wasn't the experience of the people they were organizing with. But at the same time, the people I was with and among didn't really know much about what their struggle was either, at least not that they wanted to make a part of their lives in any substantive way. Now, this happens all the time in America. Now, regardless of what your demographic is on some sort of survey, people like you that you would be assumed to be like just by virtue of some sort of specific categorization of particular factors may be completely different from you, especially politically, and may even have similar socioeconomic foundations or even possibilities, and yet want to, for whatever reason, make different determinations than you do about what to do and how to pursue that, including in terms of political organizing. This is something I was experiencing firsthand, real time. And part of it had to do also with an understanding that, at least in the culture I was in at the time, there was a different understanding of the indigenous experience in the United States as well. And there was a different experience as well of an understanding of the role of the American military in Honduras. So, in the position I'm in the position I'm in. I end up going on a tour for a while, or not even a tour, right? When you say it like that, it's like, well, what do you mean by tour? I ended up meeting with some people and revisiting some of the people I knew from before. Went to some of the communities, saw some of the things they had been doing in the time frame since. And then after that, it had a profound impact on me, and I tried to communicate it with the people I was in and among at the time. And I was exposed again to even more that I did not know. That there was a different understanding of the political inclinations when you actually got to speak to and among people, just like there is in the United States. If you just see what's in the media, if you just look at what's in the society pages as the counterpoint to what you're actually literally intimately engaged in, you might get one thing. If you only look at the crime blotter, or if you only look at the presentation of information regarding indictments of people that are alleged to somehow be a threat to the security, or people that are engaged in attempting to defame what would be the majority candidate or even the political structure at hand, you get one perspective, right? I say this because when I returned to the United States in March, late February, March of 2016, I had a real time connection with an indigenous leader, or what was later announced to be an indigenous leader in Honduras, a man, probably in his early 50s. He was assassinated. The story at the time said that what had happened was he was a Lenca man, and he was a part of a Lenca organization that was supportive of the National Party. And when I was in Honduras in 2015, many of the people I met who identified as Honduran, but also understood and would express their understanding of their indigenous heritage, whether they identified it tribally or not, believed more in their political affiliations with the aims of the National Party. For them, it provided them with practical things. It provided them with practical things, especially when it came to addressing matters relating to their farming and protection, and as well as the sorts of methods they needed to be able to avail themselves of possibilities for education for their children. And this was a very big thing. The difference between those who wanted to participate in the private education system and those who wanted to participate in the public education system, the actual politics of it are much more sophisticated than what we get through our distillation of the American political perspective on the situation. And so many of the people I came to care a great deal about and even hoped to maintain long term, potentially even family relationships with, were people that identified as indigenous, with people that were not interested in the kind of political organizing I was or that I had been involved with earlier. And their criticisms also had to do a lot with their intercession with the law, the legal system. The understanding I had is that this man who was assassinated was a critic of a local district attorney in his area. There was a district attorney who had identified some people affiliated with his community as being targets of some sort of investigation that she was leading or what she was involved with. At one point, the story was he drove up in front of her house and he started yelling at her from outside of her house about how she had done something. My understanding is he didn't cross the property line, he didn't go up to her house. But, not so ironically, if you talk with other people, one of the things they talk about frequently is, especially if they're in the campesino areas, if they're in their private homes, that the people that are attempting to pressure them politically will drive up on the periphery and will do surveillance. And they'll stand there and they'll take pictures. And they'll engage in this sort of psyop where they'll show up in cars and stand right on the periphery of your land. They won't say anything. They'll just take pictures. And it's a way to let you know that they're watching you. They're watching you, they're watching what you're doing. Now, my understanding is he didn't do that. He drove up and he yelled at her. He yelled at her. She represented it as if he threatened her. Within a very short time, less than a week later, he was murdered. My understanding is he was killed with a machete. And the implication was that he had no right to challenge her like that. This was the concern. He had challenged her, and he had challenged her in a way that made quite an ordeal. And that in the manner that he challenged her, well, he ended up getting a machete, and he died. 3 days after he died, I talked with somebody about his death because I had a portending that there was going to be another death. And 3 days after that conversation, Berta Carceres was murdered. Now, technically speaking, Both of these people were Lenca leaders, but they came from contrary political inclinations. If you haven't been there, you may not understand what that means. Literally, the community where the people I would consider to be my family come from is right down the street from a large campesino community, farming community. It's politically affiliated. They identify themselves as being members of that political organization. Now, you go a little further up the road, and they're not in that organization. They do things differently. They don't have a problem with those people down there so much as I understand. They share stuff, they go to town, they buy stuff from each other, they do stuff together, but their understanding of what they want to do with the land is different than what those guys down the road want to do. As a matter of fact, when we were leaving to go back to where we were going, we stopped by there to get some things. It's different in that way. You need to talk to people, yeah. Did they ask me to talk to some people on their behalf? Well, yes, they did. But in the meantime, I was supposed to take drugs in front of my students, and I said I have to leave the country. I'm not going to stay here in a situation where in order for me to stay inside, I have to actually take drugs that are not prescribed and have not been given to me by a doctor in front of my students because somebody didn't like the way I responded to them, trying to do an unannounced bag search of my students in my classroom. I never got to have those conversations. I never got to talk with the people from the community that invited me to be a part of it, asked me to talk to in order to help figure out some things that, by the way, were connected to people that were getting financed from the United States. What ended up happening is that instead, on the day I was supposed to have that meeting, somebody invaded the campesino community right outside the town where I taught and killed a family member of one of my former students. The same day, somebody in the United States had legal trouble. And that brings up grandpa. Not my grandpa, somebody else's grandpa. I have not been able to speak to a member of any legal association, anybody in an official legal capacity. I've not been able to get a lawyer. I've not been able to speak to a district attorney. I've not known any judge or even law enforcement officer to comport themselves in the most basic standard of constitutionality since a member of that legal organization told me that because we were doing work during an election season, it was not appropriate for me to say the kinds of things I was saying about a presidential candidate. You know what I mean? Now, did that man not really die? Did somebody just send me that story as a warning? Well, you gotta understand, men like him are real. They're real people. Now, I did not marry into that family. That's not the arrangement we had. But I would consider that akin to murdering someone in my fucking family because you had a corrupt DA you were trying to cover up for, including involving the world's largest organized crime syndicate moonlighting as if it's in government right here in the United States. And it does, unfortunately, cross party lines. Are you guys that indigenous? Are you that righteous in your diversity now? That you can go on both sides of the spectrum and screw over people that say basically the same thing we've been saying the entire fucking time you wanted to be acknowledged as being a professional. You said this was the law. You said these were the rules. Why do you refuse to follow them and then try to make me pay for all the crime you're trying to do with my life and my people? It's very simple. I'm sorry I'm not on a fucking tribal roll so you can justify your tax waivers and actually talk to me. I'm sorry, that didn't fucking happen. But you murdered at least both of them. You murdered both of them and you covered up the circumstances of both of them this entire fucking time. This isn't about protecting your people by trying to create a false paradigm around the murder of a political leader. I'm sorry that you and your two-party system and cutting our brains in half and trying to get your people to drive around the other half of our brain just because we won't vote for Your preferred criminal is more important than doing what you said you were here to do. And here's the problem. What if that was actually somebody's family legacy? What if somebody actually founded that organization you claim to be a part of? And all these years later, all you've done is slandered all of your own founding fathers and mothers. You slandered your founding mothers. Oh, and this is the fucked up thing. That's what got me in trouble in front of my students. Reminding them about the mothers. Now there are no mothers. You murdered them in front of me, not in Honduras.